Hey everybody, this week's video is going to be on the beginning of American imperialism, starting in the 1890s and going up to 1914. Here are your video goals. All right, so as we get started, I just want to look at what the United States looked like in 1890 and then what it looked like 10 years later in 1900, so we can think about how America changed over those 10 years. So here's a map of the United States in 1890. So all the pink areas are states, and the sort of barfy brown colored areas are territories. So these are areas controlled by the United States that are not yet states. And these are mostly places where not very many people live. So there's Wyoming, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma, which is largely Indian territory. And then there's also Alaska, which the United States bought from the Russian Empire back in the 1860s. But Alaska is mostly empty and not very many people live there either, so they're all still territories. You'll notice that Hawaii is still gray, which means that we haven't taken it over yet. So that's the United States. It's mostly just the continental United States and Alaska. 10 years later, though, the United States has expanded to take over a number of territories, especially territories in the Pacific Ocean. You see there, all those green areas are different places that have been acquired by the United States. Also, the island of Puerto Rico in the Caribbean Sea was also conquered. So the big question for our video today is, why did the United States decide to expand into an empire, and how did it then go about doing this? So let's start by looking at the reasons that the United States decided to build an empire. That is, why did it go out and start conquering all of these other territories and taking them over? So there are really three different kinds of motivations. There's economic motivations, that is, in order to make money or increase our productive capacity. There's the military or political reasons, and there's cultural reasons having to do with our beliefs about the world. So let's look at the economic first. So the economic reasons that some Americans wanted to create an empire is that they thought it would be good for business. Basically, if the United States took over some places, then there would be more people to sell stuff to, and business would grow. Also, if we took over certain islands, then it would be easier to ship stuff all over the world. A famous example of that is Hawaii. There's a really great spot called Pearl Harbor in Hawaii where you can basically dock really large ships and refuel them and send them out all over the world. So if you can control more islands, then you can trade with more of the world. For political and military reasons, one thing you have to keep in mind is that all of the great powers over in Europe, Germany, Britain, France, were building empires themselves. They were taking over as much of the world as they could. They had already split up, for example, the entire continent of Africa into a couple different big empires. And the United States was worried that if they didn't, or people in the United States, some people were worried that if they didn't go ahead and start taking over some places, then these European powers would control the entire world. So people said that maybe the United States should get in on this and take over some stuff. Also, the United States was becoming very, very powerful. It had the biggest economy in the world, and so people argued that it should also, therefore, control an empire. It should start using this power to take over stuff. And then there were some pretty ugly cultural reasons. One was the idea held by many white Americans that it was their duty, that is, the white people's duties, to go out and conquer the rest of the world and civilize the rest of the world. That is, teach non-white people how to act like white people. And this was an idea that was very popular at the time, both in the United States and in Europe. And it was famously summed up as the white man's burden. That is, it's white people's job to go out and civilize the whole rest of the world. Also, there was this thing called jingoism that was sort of like super patriotic nationalism, where people wanted the United States to go out and take over the rest of the world, so that way the United States could be better than all the other countries. Jingoism is almost when you cheer for your country the way that some people cheer today for like football teams and stuff. They wanted the United States to be number one, to go out and take over stuff to prove that they were the strongest country. And last of all, there was this thing called yellow journalism, which was there were a couple of famous newspapers circulating that were competing to sell more and more newspapers. And they were basically willing to make up stuff in order to sell more newspapers. And so they would appeal to racism and jingoism in their papers in order to sell more newspapers. And they would sort of encourage people to think that that empire and expansion was a good idea. Here's just a little bit more background for you guys. So this is a map of the world in 1900, and it shows how much of the world was controlled by different empires. So everywhere on the map that is colored in, other than gray, is a spot that was part of an empire. So you see most of Africa is either blue or pink. That means that it was controlled either by the French or the British Empire. So as the world was getting gobbled up by these different empires, the United States started to think that maybe it needed to go out and conquer some stuff before the whole world was taken over by a couple European countries. So anyway, sort of the whole beginning of imperialism happens kind of because of a book written by one dude. His name is Alfred Thayer Mahan, and he wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And the main idea of this book was that whatever country can control the sea controls everything. If you have the biggest navy in the world, then you are in charge of the world. You run the world. And he talked a lot about Great Britain and how the British were able to set up a huge empire because they had always had the biggest navy. And so this book is really important because it convinces the United States to invest millions and millions of dollars in building a very powerful navy that's made up of these fancy modern steel battleships, some of the biggest ships that had ever been built up to that point. And because of this guy's book, within like 8 or 9 years, the United States has become one of the major sea powers in the world and is ready to take on other European empires. The first place that kind of falls under the sway of European imperialism is the archipelago in the Pacific Ocean called Hawaii, which is today a state. So in the mid-1800s, it had already become a very important trading post for American ships, partially because it had a number of strategic harbors, most importantly, Pearl Harbor. Also on the Hawaiian Islands, you see the growth of sugar and fruit plantations that are owned by American businesses. And these businessmen, and also the traders who use Hawaii, beg the United States to annex Hawaii. Annexation is just where one country takes over some other part of the world. The Hawaiian natives, led by their queen, resist U.S. annexation, but it doesn't last very long, and by the time that the Spanish-American War breaks out in 1898, the United States just goes ahead and annexes Hawaii. And they announce that all Hawaiians will be U.S. citizens. So we extend the Constitution and the rights to the people living in Hawaii. The next spot where trouble flares up is in the island of Cuba. Cuba is the biggest island in the Caribbean. You can see it right there. It's only about 90 miles south of Florida. And from the 1500s to 1898, Cuba is controlled by the Spanish. But the Spanish haven't really been doing a great job running Cuba, and there's poverty and all sorts of problems there. And this leads to rebellion by Cuban locals. So the Cubans rise up and try to throw the Spanish out. And the United States is paying very careful attention to this because they know that Cuba is the key to controlling the Caribbean Sea. If you can control Cuba, then you can control the Caribbean. Also, the United States has invested millions and millions of dollars in Cuba, and they're afraid that if the rebellion doesn't go the way they want it to, they'll lose all of this money. And so because of this, the United States sends a battleship called the USS Maine to the capital of Cuba, Havana. And there, something unexpected happens. The USS Maine, docked right outside of the city of Havana, blows up. There's a huge explosion, and most of the people on the ship die. And there's some argument about why this happened, but today it's pretty sure that we're pretty sure that it was just an accident. Um, the coal that was used to run the steamship sparked and accidentally blew up a bunch of gunpowder that was on the ship. But anyway, the yellow journalists, who are basically lying in order to sell newspapers, immediately blame Spain and demand that we go to war with Spain. And this fires up all the jingoistic people in the United States, and they demand that we take over or go to war with Spain. So while this is happening, even before we've officially declared war, a young man named Theodore Roosevelt, who is the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, decides to launch an attack against Spain in the Pacific Ocean, totally different place than where the explosion happens. And then a little bit later, Congress goes on to declare war against Spain. So now the United States is, for the first time since 1812, at war against a European power. The Spanish-American War is a pretty one-sided fight. Spain is not very powerful at this point. It hasn't really industrialized. It can't really produce many weapons or ships or anything like that. But the United States is now the biggest industrial power in the world. So it has tons and tons of ships and rifles and cannons and all that stuff. And so the United States easily defeats Spain. They crush the Spanish Navy in the Philippines in the Pacific Ocean, and then they invade Cuba. And Teddy Roosevelt, who launched the invasion of the Philippines, then quits his job and joins the army. And he joins this special division called the Rough Riders, and it becomes famous for fighting in some of the battles in Cuba during the Spanish-American War. And there's a picture there. That's Teddy Roosevelt on the horse, charging up a hill, leading troops into battle. So Teddy Roosevelt kind of becomes a celebrity and a war hero during the Spanish-American War. So anyway, Spain is defeated very quickly. They can't compete with the United States. And Spain is forced to give up control of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. And the United States is now recognized as a world power. The question now, though, is what is the United States going to do with all of the territory that Spain has given up? And we're going to look at each territory independently. So the first place we're going to look at is Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is a medium-sized island in the Caribbean Sea, and the United States officially annexes it and makes it part of the United States. But Puerto Rico never actually becomes a state. In fact, today it's still part of the United States, but not a state. And the inhabitants of Puerto Rico do not really receive constitutional rights, at least not right away. And so the question is does everybody that the United States take over automatically get rights? And in Puerto Rico, the answer is no. And still, Puerto Rico today people who live in Puerto Rico today don't have all the rights of people who live in states in the United States. The Philippines is probably the biggest territory. It definitely is the biggest territory taken over in the Spanish-American War. And you can see it on the map there. It's those red islands. It's a pretty big country. There's more land there than there is in the British Isles. And 7 million people live there, most of them of Asian descent. And the United States at first isn't really sure what to do about it. Some people say that it should be given back to Spain. Other people say that it should be given its independence. And other people demand that it be annexed and that it get taken over. And at first, the President McKinley, can't decide what to do. But then, and while he's thinking about it, a British poet named Rudyard Kipling writes a famous poem urging the United States to take over the Philippines, saying that it is the white man's burden, aka it is the United States' duty to take over the Philippines and to civilize the island. So anyway, eventually the United States does annex the Philippines, but once again, the citizens who live there are not granted full rights. So unlike Puerto Rico and the Philippines, in Cuba, the United States did not take over. Part of this was because the United States promised that it wouldn't take over Cuba. And the whole reason that it started the Spanish-American War was to quote unquote ensure Cuban independence. However, the United States still really needed to control Cuba because it was very important for business and for control of the rest of Latin America. So the United States kind of sneaks around its promise not to take over Cuba by basically forcing Cuba to pass the Platt Amendment. And the Platt Amendment basically puts the United States in charge of Cuba, even though Cuba remains technically independent. So the Platt Amendment allows the United States to keep their navy in Cuba. It prevents Cuba from borrowing any money from other countries unless the United States gives Cuba permission. And it lets the United States intervene in Cuban politics whenever it wants. So basically, Cuba is allowed to do its own thing, but as soon as the United States changes its mind or wants Cuba to do something different, it's allowed to step in and change the way things go. So Cuba remains independent, but not really. And this control of Cuba is part of a larger process that the United States goes through with Latin America, where basically it sets up an empire in all of Central and South America. Basically, the idea is, even though the United States isn't going to take over South America, it wants to be in charge. Latin America is going to do what the United States wants it to do. And the guy who really sets this up is the president Theodore Roosevelt, who becomes president in 1901 after McKinley is assassinated. And he really wants the United States to be a world power. He's famous for saying that the United States should speak softly but carry a big stick. That is, the United States maybe doesn't need to make a lot of fuss, but it should be very powerful and be able to get the job done when it wants to. So President Roosevelt ensures that the United States retains control of Latin America by reviving the Monroe Doctrine, which maybe you guys remember from last year. The Monroe Doctrine was first enunciated by the fifth president of the United States, James Monroe, who argued that the European powers should never be allowed to set up colonies in the New World. Basically, that North and South America were off limits to imperialism. This, of course, is very convenient to the United States. But so anyway, Teddy Roosevelt revives this and says that if Europe ever comes over and tries to take over countries, that the United States will step in to protect these other countries because we want to be in control. We don't want England or Germany to control these countries. And Roosevelt actually adds something to the Monroe Doctrine called the Roosevelt Corollary, which says that the United States is allowed to step in and interfere in any Latin American country in order to keep European empires out. So if it ever looks like a country is about to go over to a European empire, the United States is allowed to go there and basically stop that from happening. And the takeaway from this is that by the end of Teddy Roosevelt's time in office, the United States basically controls all of Central and South America. So they've set up an informal empire in that area and are selling all sorts of stuff and getting all sorts of stuff from this area. One really important thing for U.S. control of South America and of the Pacific Ocean is the Panama Canal. Basically, for the United States to be powerful in both the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, it needs to be able to connect its west coast and its east coast. And before that, it took a very, very long time to sail all the way around South America to get to California. So what they decide to do is they decide to dig a canal through the skinny spot in Central America, the isthmus at Panama. And at first, Panama is controlled by a South American country called Colombia, and Colombia refuses to allow the United States to dig a canal through Panama. So what the United States does is they cause a rebellion in Colombia. They back a bunch of rebels in Panama. Panama breaks away. The United States recognizes this little country, Panama, and the new country of Panama forms. So the United States causes a rebellion in order to get its canal. They then send in work crews to dig a canal. It takes a long time. A lot of people die of malaria. But by 1914, the canal is completed. And now the United States can sail a ship from New York to San Francisco, and it's only 8,000 kilometers, as opposed to 21,000 kilometers by the 21,000 kilometers it would take to go around South America. So this increases U.S. control of Central and South America, and also increases U.S. control of the Pacific Ocean. So let's take a moment to consider the effects of all of these different imperial policies. So first of all, this definitely increases U.S. wealth and power. It allows the United States to expand control into both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. We have a powerful Navy. We have island bases all over the place where we can refuel our steam warships with coal. We now control Latin America, thanks to the Roosevelt Corollary. And also, because of all the islands in the Pacific, and because of our base in the Philippines, the United States also has increased ability to trade with Asia, especially China and Japan. So all of this combined makes the U.S. a very, very powerful country on the global stage. But there are also costs to imperialism. First of all, it leads to competition with other empires. Now that the United States is showing how powerful it really is, the other empires start to worry about it. Most significantly, Japan starts to view the United States as a rival, especially because Japan also wants to control the Pacific Ocean. And this ultimately is going to result in the war between the United States and Japan during World War II that starts when Japan attacks the United States Navy base in Hawaii. Also, a lot of the people who are conquered by the United States, especially in the Philippines, are unhappy about this. And the United States faces years of rebellion and conflict after taking over these places. So even though it's pretty easy to defeat Spain, it's much harder to get the people in these conquered areas to play along with the U.S. ideas of empire. So anyway, that's U.S. imperialism. It definitely doesn't stop there. The United States continues to expand its world power, but this is how the United States gets its start as a global imperial power. Thanks for listening.